My name is Wendy. A strange name for an old man, you might say? Once it had sounded proud, because it was associated with business contracts, confident handshakes, and the respect of people who knew that if Wendy promised, it would be so. And now this name is an empty echo, lost in the peeling walls of my small house on the outskirts of town. I wake up early, before sunrise. It is a habit that cannot be abandoned. My body creaks, my joints crack, as if I am sitting on old wood that is about to crumble into pieces. In the darkness, I find my dressing gown, throw off the blanket, and slowly get up. The kitchen greets me with cold and the smell of dust. I put the kettle on, listen to the water gurgling and bubbling, and think, who else, besides me, cares that I can still listen to this music? My children. They live their own lives. My daughter is successful, as she likes to say. My son is even more successful than her. They have families, loans, business trips, important calls. And not a single minute to listen to an old man sitting alone in his armchair with cracked upholstery. When they do come, it's with cold smiles, as if out of duty. I can feel how nervous they are when I start to reminisce about the past. It's uncomfortable for them because they don't need my stories anymore. My grandchildren. They've grown up, and in their eyes I'm an obstacle, an unnecessary burden. When I try to joke or ask about their affairs, they give a curt, "Yeah, that's fine." My phone calls irritate them, and my visits even more. I can feel it, I can see it in their gestures, in the way they avert their eyes. They don't notice me in the store. The saleswoman can stand and not even raise her head when I say hello. At the market, they give me the worst vegetables, because who would argue with an old man? In the hospital, I am interrupted when I try to explain what hurts. "You are so old that something will hurt every time," the doctor says and hurries on. All my life I have built, created, fought. And now I am just a background. A ghostly person who is not heard, seen, or counted. I can be ignored because no one expects decisions, strength, or wisdom from me anymore. Sometimes I look in the mirror and see only wrinkles, faded eyes, a figure that has lost its meaning. But inside, something begins to rot. It is like an invisible crack in the concrete that is getting wider every day. Every indifferent remark, every cold look from children, every mockery in a public place is a small blow to this crack. I was silent, I suffered, I wrote everything off for years. But now the silence has become a prison cell. And in this cell a different feeling is born. The resentment is not sharp, but deep, viscous, like tar. It sticks to thoughts and does not let go. I sit in the dark in the evenings and think, was my whole life supposed to end like this? Or maybe there is something else? Can I still remind these people who I was and who I remain? I have been forgotten. But I still remember. I often catch myself living not in today, but in yesterday. The past for me is not just a set of pictures, but the only place where I feel alive. When I close my eyes, the smell of the present dust and dampness recedes, and I hear the hum of offices, telephone conversations again, and feel the weight of my own voice. My business started from nothing. I was young, stubborn, and hungry for life. I was not afraid to work from morning till night, not afraid to take risks, to sign deals that others twiddled their fingers at. And you know what? I won. I rose where others fell. I saw opportunities where people saw walls. I was the one who broke down doors and opened them for others. My children remember the golden years, but they don't know what they cost. They saw only the glitter trips, an expensive table, holiday dinners, new things. And behind this were sleepless nights, blood, nerves, lost friends, buried illusions. I sacrificed myself so that they could have a different start, a different life. And I was proud that I could give them more than I received myself. I remember holding their hands when they were little, lifting them onto my shoulders, showing them the world from above. Then they looked at me with faith and love, as a person who could not fall. I was a wall for them, behind which they were safe. And it seemed to me that it would always be like this. But the years pass. The business that once flourished began to drown in debts and crises. I gave everything to save it, but the world has already changed, new players, new rules. I lost this war, but I remained with dignity. At least, that's how it seemed to me then. Because the worst thing is not to lose money. The worst thing is to lose face in the eyes of those you raised. When the children grew up, they saw that their big father was no longer the lion who roared in business circles. They began to treat me like an old book, once interesting, but now covered in dust, to be left on the shelf because the new stories are more interesting. And I feel this contrast so vividly that it cuts my heart. In my memories, I am still strong, full of energy, my voice resounds firmly in the meeting room. In my memories, my children look at me with pride. In my memories, my wife, her kingdom in heaven, smiles as if I were her hero. But in reality, the walls are silent, the phone does not ring, and even the shadows of past victories seem like a mockery. I see my past like a movie that is being played over and over again. But no one wants to watch this movie anymore. They are bored listening to my stories. They do not care that behind every word I say there are years of experience, blood, and loss. They don't understand that without me they wouldn't have what they have now. And that emptiness is the scariest thing. Because when you've given everything and got silence in return, you start to ask yourself, was it worth it? And that thought eats away at you like rust does to metal. It widens the crack that's already appeared in me. But there's something else living in those memories. Strength. I remember what it's like to win. I remember what it's like to not give up. And maybe someday these skills will come in handy again. Because I'm not just an old man who can be thrown overboard. I'm the same Wendy, only now I smile less and speak more quietly. But who said silence can't be dangerous? I started keeping a diary. Not to leave behind some kind of memoir. Who needs them? No, I write so I don't forget. Because every case of indifference, every small death that is thrust upon me every day, deserves to be preserved. So that later, I can remember. Children. They rarely call. And when they do pick up the phone, the conversation is short and cold, as if they are in a hurry to get rid of me, like an annoying debt collector. Dad, I'm busy right now. Dad, I have a meeting. And you can already hear the short beeps. I look at the phone and think, wasn't I once the one who always had time for them? I would drop things to come to a school holiday. I would get up in the middle of the night to take them to the doctor. And now they can't even spare a few minutes. My grandson is a brash, self-confident boy. He used to look at me with pride. Now, with irritation. The last time I called him and asked how he was doing, he coldly snapped. Grandpa, don't you understand? I have my own life. You don't need to call so often. I then silently hung up the phone, but my fingers were shaking. And I wrote in my diary, Alexei. March 14th. Irritated tone. Said I was in the way. In the hospital, they treat me like I'm a piece of furniture. I explain to the doctor that I'm worried about chest pain, and he interrupts. At your age, anything can hurt. Don't make it up. His eyes didn't even stop at me. He spoke through me as if I were transparent. And I wrote in my diary, Dr. Savchuk. April 2nd. Arrogance. Contempt. A woman pushed me in the store because, you see, I was moving slowly and holding up the line. Old man, have you been there long? She snapped. People laughed. I gathered my things, paid, my hands shaking with resentment. I didn't answer. I couldn't. But at home I stared out the window for a long time, and these words rang in my head. I wrote down, Woman in line. May 19th. Mockery. Laughter. My house is full of silence, but this silence is like a surveillance camera. In it I hear all the voices that offended me, I see all the faces that looked down on me. I began to picture them in my memory more clearly than my own children in childhood. Names, dates, small details. I even began to notice how the shades of their voices changed, how some laughed dully, and some sharply. My diary turned into a list of debtors. They may have forgotten those moments because for them it was just a small scene, a random word. But for me it was like a nail in the heart. I remember everything. I am the archive of their indifference. And sooner or later this archive will become a weapon. Every day brings new trials. Every day is a new small death. But something else is emerging in me. Anger. It is still quiet, still somewhere under my ribs, but I feel its power. It warms me when I lie at night and look at the ceiling. I don't know exactly how yet, but I feel, soon this anger will find an outlet. That day was an ordinary day, like any other. I went out to buy groceries. A trifle that had not meant much to me until recently was now a test. My steps were heavy, my hands were shaking, and the packages seemed unbearably heavy. But I stubbornly walked on, because even in small things a person tries to prove to himself that he is capable of something more. At the market, I bought some potatoes, bread, and a bottle of milk. Simple, everyday. I paid, folded the change, and headed home. The packages cut into my palms, I clenched them, clenching my teeth. And then one of the packages tore. The vegetables scattered onto the asphalt, the milk hit the ground with a dull thud and cracked, leaving a white puddle. I stopped, crouched, and tried to pick up the potatoes, but my fingers wouldn't obey, they slipped. People walked by. Some walked past me as if I were garbage lying on the sidewalk. "Boy, help me," I said to the young man walking nearby. He looked back, smiled wryly, and said, "What, Grandpa, can't you do it yourself? Why do you even need these packages? You can barely stand." Someone nearby laughed. Another woman added, "Yeah, you should stay home, not run around here, bothering people." I felt their words cutting me like a knife. I looked down at the broken bottle of milk, at the dirty potatoes rolling in the puddle, and suddenly something changed in me. My vision blurred. The world seemed to recede, sounds became muffled. I no longer heard laughter, only a hum, like a ringing in my ears. Something inside me woke up. Something that had been asleep for a long time. Something that I had hidden for years under the mask of patience. I slowly straightened up. They were still laughing, and I already knew that this day would be the beginning. I gathered what I could and went home. But I was walking differently. I had no shame, only cold. It wasn't a scream, it wasn't despair. It was something clear, hard, like a knife blade. I was no longer a victim. When I entered my house and closed the door, silence greeted me. But now it was a different silence. It didn't oppress, it didn't suffocate. It listened. In that silence, I felt a plan being born. I sat down at the table, opened my diary, and wrote in large letters. May 26th. Street. Laughter. Faces. Voices. This is the last time. My hand didn't tremble. I looked at those lines and smiled. Now the silence was filled with my anger. And that anger was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon. They thought I was old, broken, useless. They laughed when I reached out for help. But now I will extend another hand, a hand that does not forgive. And none of them will know when or where retribution will come. I turned back to the window. The world outside seemed the same as always: cars, people, bustle. But to me it had changed. Because from now on it was no longer a world in which I was superfluous. This was the playing field. And I knew the rules better than they did. The game had begun. I was never a man of action. Even in those days when the world revolved around my decisions, I planned ahead, step by step, like a chess player who sees a game to checkmate. Now, with another goal burning within me, I was the same strategist again, only the arena and the stakes had changed. This was not a stage for storm and shouting. This was to be a cold, measured operation, where every move was the least noticeable, but every result was inevitable. I opened the old drawers of my memory and took out what I had hidden under the dust for many years. Addresses, names, telephone numbers, people with whom I had once shared cigarettes on winter nights, exchanged debts and words that became deals. I also had contacts with those who knew how to make a person end up where they were not expected, not with a crowbar or a shout, but with small pushes after which the chains begin to fall. I didn't want to ruin lives physically. My goal was different: to make everyone experience a mirror they had never looked into. I started with the children. But not in open confrontation, no. I studied their schedules, listened to the voices of their assistants, read between the lines of letters and messages. One letter was a spark, an incorrectly drawn-up contract, a signature that could be challenged, a mention of an old deal that had slipped the accountant's memory. I didn't give them direct evidence. I only gave them seeds of doubt. And from there, like a worm in an apple, a crack began. Phone calls became harsh, meetings became heated. Eventually, there were screams, reproaches, tears in the house. My daughter, accustomed to upper class and control, suddenly had to choose between image and what was true. My son, who had always convinced himself that time heals all, had nowhere to hide his shame. I didn't ask them to fall, I just showed them what they looked like from the side. Grandchildren are a different story. They reached out for support only when it was profitable. I hated their indifference not with words but with actions that aptly undermined their supports. Student grants, startup funds that I had once saved, all of this was now under question. Financial difficulties are a cold, slow infection. They cause panic, quarrels, suspicions among friends and colleagues. The guys who used to laugh at my jokes now called with requests, but in their voices there was fear. They couldn't understand where the wind was blowing from, and that was the sweetest thing. My art is not in physical attack, but in the manipulation of reality. I painted events so that they looked like a series of bad luck, mistakes, and coincidences. Mail with mixed-up papers, fake information, an imperceptibly substituted person in a position who made a careless step. When suspicion grows within a circle of people, panic does more harm than anger. And most importantly, I left traces that did not lead to me. They looked for the culprit in themselves and in each other, and not in those who sat quietly in the shadows. I talked again with old acquaintances, those who knew how to convince, how to make a witness forget, how to leave an entry in a data bank that would disappear in a month. All this is not crime in the crude sense. It is a theatrical storm of small surprises, who broke careers, trust, friendships. When a person destroys relationships themselves, they painfully see themselves from the side. What is they like when they are stripped of their mask? Gradually, my victims were engulfed by their own insecurity. Children quarreled, grandchildren lost friends and support, acquaintances became suspicious. Former partners discovered mistakes where they had not looked before. Some began to call lawyers, others to friends, and still others in a panic sought excuses. I sat in the shade, watched, made short notes in a diary, and studied how people lose ground under their feet. I did not rejoice in their suffering. No. My joy was in something else, in the fact that they finally began to see. To see themselves not in the mirror of success, but in the mirror of actions. And when they asked, why? The answer was hidden in silence. They learned, but this lesson was paid for with pain. I remained in the shadows. No one knew who had pushed the first domino. It all seemed like a series of sad coincidences. But I was there, a cold cameraman behind the scenes. I could feel the respect returning, but not after a moment of false respect. They respected me now, when fear and shame had forced them to seek support, and see that support had once been the responsibility of someone else. I didn't want to destroy completely. I wanted to teach. And the teaching was deep and harsh. When a house is cracked, people either repair it with love or leave it empty. I watched who chose what. And that night, as I put down my pen, I thought, revenge is not about winning over others. It is about reclaiming one's voice and place. I reclaimed them not with a shout, but with a silence where every word is forged from truth. Revenge is not about winning over others. It is about reclaiming one's voice and place. I reclaimed them not with a scream, but with a silence where every word is forged from truth. Revenge is not about winning over others. It is about reclaiming one's voice and place. I reclaimed them not with a scream, but with a silence where every word is forged from truth. When everything quieted down, when the last pieces of my little operation fell into place and formed a picture, I understood one simple thing: revenge does not cleanse the soul, it levels it. I did not seek applause or dream of theatrical repentance. I wanted to restore balance so that those who once saw in me only a chess piece on the board of their comfort could look at themselves and recognize their reflection. The children came to me silently at different times. Not all at once, not all voluntarily. Their steps were heavy, like mine once. They thought they would bring an apology or an explanation, but I did not need words that they did not feel. I listened to their voices. In one there was restraint, in the other the fear of losing what they had built. We did not sign off on an admission of guilt. Instead, unexpected questions were put on the table. Why didn't you call when I was sick? Why did you let others decide for me? Why was your respect conditional? They tried to justify themselves, to weave words of justification, but the inner catalyst had already worked. What I wanted to see flashed in their eyes: surprise at their own shadow. Grandchildren. With them everything was different. Their pride was not immediately broken, but my cold lesson began to work. They lost friends, experienced financial difficulties, lost confidence in their own decisions. It was painful for them and for me. I was not happy about their downfall. My joy was that they were starting to look not through themselves, but at themselves. When one of them came and for the first time without irony asked for advice, I knew something had changed. Not because of my power, but because of their desire to understand how to prevent this emptiness from happening again. Society also responded, but not succinctly and not immediately. People who used to laugh began to be careful with their words. Wisdom that had previously gone unnoticed now commanded respect, sometimes fearful, sometimes spiteful. I saw former critics turn their heads when I entered the store. It was not a triumph, it was a consequence. They understood that behind every old face there could be strength, if it were awakened. But most importantly, I had regained my voice. Not the voice of one who screams revenge, but the voice of one who knows the price of one's own dignity. My life had not become more joyful in these months, but it had become more real. I had learned not to ask for respect, but to demand it as a fact. And if I had once forgiven lightly, now my forgiveness had weight. It was tantamount to correction, change, work on myself. I had not destroyed my family. I had forced it to survive itself, and this painful rebirth gave me a chance for a new beginning. Sometimes at night, when the house was silent again, I would return to my diary. It has not become a place of hysteria. It has become a true and loyal friend who remembers who we are. I look through the records, where the names are written in cold handwriting, and I feel at peace. Revenge has come, not as a fiery retribution, but as an inevitability born of truth and long-term action. Those who wronged me now see themselves. And that is enough. I do not celebrate. I simply sit in my chair, listening as the street lives on. But no one smiles anymore when I ask for advice. When people talk to me, their voices have a respect, sometimes reserved, sometimes belated. And that suits me. Because I've learned, revenge is not about destroying another, it's about restoring oneself. The last entry in my diary is not a threat or a fancy phrase. It's a bodily truth called dignity. I wrote it in capital letters carefully, as if leaving a signature under my life. Don't let the world make a shadow of you. Remember, you were once a force, and force can be silent. Reclaim your voice, and no one can ignore it anymore.
Subscribe and like, and send the video to your friends.